Well, let's get you more on this now and talk to the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Very good morning to you. As Becky was saying there, you have said finally the government is seeing sense on this. But as Mayor of London, couldn't you have introduced this on TfL, on Transport for London, before now?
First, I do welcome the government's U-turn, but the difficulties of Transport for London going alone more than 2 months ago when I first called for this is because we're not responsible for all of transport in London. Many of the network trails that come into London, network rail trains that come into London, commuter trains that come into London aren't under our control. But I think it is important when you have a national crisis that there's a clarity of messaging. And I think it would have been wrong for there to be mixed messages being given from us in TfL, bearing in mind that we want a national consensus and many Londoners rely upon national media for their news and, of course, huge confusion. But I do welcome this change of mind from the government.
Is it fair to put it as a change of mind, though? I mean, as Grant Shapps was saying this morning, I mean, although London is a slightly different scenario, you know, for everywhere else, you know, the amount of people on public transport has dropped by what, 99% in some cases. So this wasn't necessary up until now, he says.
Well, let me tell you why I think the government's got it wrong on this issue. There are other issues they've got it wrong on as well. So more than 2 months ago, the evidence was quite clear, not just from experts in this country, but from the US Centre for Control of Diseases and Prevention, from the Canadian Chief Public Health Officer, from Austria, from Germany, from China, from Mumbai, other countries around the world, which is that although a facial covering by itself won't stop you catching the virus, on top of all the additional things we do, washing your hands regularly and thoroughly, keeping your social distance more than 2 meters, if you wear a facial covering, it stops you passing on the virus if you're pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic, and if other people wear it, it stops you catching it. Now, the reality is, with the best will in the world, there will be occasions, even when you're using public transport and keeping your social distance, or going into a shop where it's not possible to keep 2 meters apart, you're coming into social interaction. That's why, as a precautionary measure, there is no downside to doing so. And I don't understand why it's taken this long for the government to reach its view in relation to making it compulsory. I think it should be extended to shops as well, not because we're encouraging people to break the 2 meter rule, but because human nature as it is, and sometimes there can be congestion, this is another step we can take to mitigate the chances of catching the virus or passing it on.
It's interesting. I think a lot of people would agree with you, and yet it was interesting as one of the Vox Pops earlier on talking to one of your Londoners who was saying maybe this, you know, it is slightly problematic because people wearing a mask do, you know, by the nature of it, feel a bit more protected, and possibly, you know, that is going to, you know, give them a sense that they can be a bit more free and easy with the social distancing.
Well, the other 2 Londoners said the opposite. The point is this: we've got to do whatever we can to fight this virus. My experience of wearing a facial covering is it basically is a way of alerting others the virus is here. Don't come close to me and keep your distance. I'm quite clear, though, by itself, this is not a panacea, but on top of the other things, it can make a real difference. And it's really important that we do all the other things, keep a social distance, wash your hands regularly and thoroughly. If you're out and about, use a hand sanitizer, and we've got to do all those things as well. What we shouldn't do is assume this somehow makes you immune from catching the virus. It doesn't, and that's why it's really important we don't say this is instead of all the other measures, it's as well as.
Look, so far this morning, you've talked about the importance of social distancing a number of times, and yet, as Mayor of London, you haven't done anything to try to stop the protest, the Black Lives Matter protests in London. Well, look, who would want to stop them? No one in their right mind. But clearly there is a very big problem with social distancing at these protests.
Yeah, thank you for the way you just introduced this topic. It's really important. We understand, you and I, why people want to protest and make it clear that Black Lives Matter. It's really important that people who feel strongly about this are able to protest. But we've also got to be aware we're in the midst of a global pandemic. And with the best of intentions, wishing to go and protest, you may inadvertently, by being too close to somebody else, either pass the virus on or catch the virus. And how would you feel if you then went home and gave it to an older relation in your home who, ultimately lost his or her life? That's why my advice to anybody who is going to be protesting today, tomorrow, or Sunday is to please, if you feel that strongly that you've got to go and protest, I personally am not. Please make sure you follow the advice. Keep 2 meters apart. Wear a facial covering just in case you can't keep 2 meters apart. Wash your hands regularly and thoroughly. And if you can't, carry with you a hand sanitizer. These rules are there to keep you safe and also your loved ones as well.
What's your take on what we're seeing with that? There have been some disturbing incidents in London in those protests. I mean, as we always say in this sort of scenario, that's always the minority. But obviously that changes the perspective that a lot of people have when we see violence against police officers or even against a camera crew, I think, the other day. It's very difficult to keep tempers totally calm in these sort of scenarios, isn't it? I mean, how do you begin to manage that, do you think?
Well, the vast majority of those protesting did so peacefully, lawfully, and safely. A very small minority acted in a way that is unacceptable. They were abusive and violent towards our police officers. There can be no excuse for doing so. And all they've done, it not only injured our police officers and been abusive towards them, but they've detracted from what is a really important issue. Black Lives Matter. George Floyd's awful, brutal death is what we should be talking about, and addressing the racism, the discrimination, and the inequalities Black people face in my city, in our country, and around the world. And it's really important nobody's under any mistaken impression that it is acceptable to be abusive or violent towards police officers or even journalists. I mean, journalists are there doing their job. They're reporting this protest. The idea somebody would turn on a journalist or a camera person, I find objectionable. And it's really important we don't allow those really serious points to detract from an important issue, which is the brutal death of George Floyd. The fact that in 2020, it is still the case in the most progressive city in the world, London, that if you're born a Black Londoner, your life chances and even your life expectancy are less than many other ethnic groups.
How do you think we start to shed a light on all of this? Because it's taken me by surprise in that I'm someone who I would not consider myself to be racist in any way, but I guess I'm not in a situation where I'm seeing racist behaviour. I'm not mixing with people who would behave in that way. I mean, I'm lucky because my dear friend and colleague Gillian, I was able to ring up and say, how does this work? How are you affected? What is going on with all of this? And she was able to talk to me from her perspective about it. But for a lot of people, that may not be an option. And it seems to be shedding a light on something that obviously wrongly a lot of us just weren't aware of.
Well, what you've articulated is the reality that both you and I don't really understand what it's like to be a Black person. And Gillian does, and your Black viewers do. And what we've got to make sure we understand is we're not lulled into a full sense of complacency where we think what happened to George Floyd can only happen in Minneapolis, Minnesota, America. When you speak to a Black person, most Black people will tell you that one of the things that went through their mind when they saw the brutal killing of George Floyd is, but for the grace of God. But for the grace of God, that could have been me, my dad, my brother, my son, my cousin. And that's why it's really important that we educate ourselves about what it's like so we can have empathy with our Black friends, members of our family who are Black, our colleagues, about what they're going through. And the reality is racism takes many forms. It can be covert, it can be overt. What prejudice basically means is prejudging. And we can be guilty of prejudging based upon preconceptions. And what the Black community are crying out for is a recognition that their lives matter. That's why I welcome what the Equalities and Human Rights Commission have announced today, that as a result of my request for them to look into the issue of disproportionality when it comes to COVID-19, I think the brutal death of George Floyd, the disproportionality we've seen with COVID-19 should be a catalyst for meaningful change to address the structural inequalities that leads to the case in 2020, black people are still facing racism, discrimination and inequality in my city, in our country and around the world.
Sadiq Khan, we appreciate your time this morning. Thanks very much indeed.